Okay, hey everyone, Assalamu alaikum, and welcome to Module 3 of the Research Workplan. Hope you all are doing well. I am Sania, one of the founding members of the Emirates Collaboration of Residents in Emergency Medicine, ECREM.
Hey guys, Assalamu alaikum. I'm Nader Saeed. I'm one of the senior technical editors at ECREM.
So we want to thank you all for joining us on our third session under the Evidence-Based Medicine Grand Round series, the Research Workplan. So the Research Workplan is designed basically as a modular series of lectures that altogether create a roadmap of conducting scientific research with content tailored towards EM residents in the UAE, but generalizable to all national and international physicians, residents, medical students, and interns who are interested in navigating research from concept to reality.
As you may have read from our brochures, this initiative is made possible thanks to a collaboration with the team over at Best Evidence in Emergency Medicine, or BEAM. BEAM is an international emergency medicine knowledge translation program created by EM physicians for EM practitioners, and has the mission and vision of being the most valid, reliable, and unbiased global source of current clinically relevant patient-centered evidence for EM physicians to provide the best clinical evidence to optimize patient care. We are incredibly grateful and proud to host some amazing physician researchers from both the UAE and Canada who have put forth an invaluable effort to produce the content within this series.
Hey everyone, this is Tasneem Mohammed, a board member at ECREM, and it's my pleasure to host this module with you. A few housekeeping notes before we get started. Please note that this session is being recorded and will be posted on ECREM website. You will remain muted throughout the session to minimize the background noise, so kindly use the chat box if you have any questions, and the moderators will keep track of your questions and present them towards the end of the session in the live question and answer session. Finally, if you have any issues or experience any technical issues during the session, contact me directly using the chat box, and hope you have informative and engaging session.
Thank you, Tasneem. So without further ado, allow me to introduce our first speaker for the day, Dr. Sameer Sharif. Dr. Sameer Sharif is an assistant professor at the Department of Medicine, Division of Critical Care and Emergency Medicine at McMaster University. He is also a clinical educator and is currently completing his master's in health research methods with a focus on sedation in the ER and in ICU. Dr. Sameer graduated from his EM residency in 2019 and completed his critical care fellowship in 2020 at McMaster. During his training, he was recognized with the Outstanding Emergency Medicine Resident Award, Outstanding Critical Care Medicine Resident Award, and the McMaster Postgraduate Medical Education Resident Mentor Award. More recently, his work was acknowledged by the American College of Emergency Physicians, or ACEP, with the Emergency Medicine and Critical Care Medicine Rising Star Award. Welcome, Dr. Sameer.
Hi, everyone. My name is Sameer Sharif, and I'm an assistant professor at McMaster University in the Department of Medicine, Division of Critical Care and Emergency Medicine. I'm also a clinician educator, and I'm honored to be here to present for ECREM on blinding, bias, and confidentiality for the evidence-based medicine grand rounds. My email address is there on the title slide, as well as my Twitter handle. If you guys have any questions, I'm more than happy to take them. We'll start with the outline of this talk. There is a pretest component to this. There are 5 questions. I'm just going to go over the questions very briefly in the beginning of my talk, and you should be able to find the answers for the duration of this as well. We'll talk about, for the most part, three things. Number one, blinding. We'll talk about why it's important, some of the historical aspects of it, some of the pitfalls if it's not done properly. We'll talk about bias, specifically different categories of bias in research and how to circumvent them and avoid them completely if possible. Finally, we'll be talking about confidentiality as well, with the caveat there being that I practice in Canada. So a lot of my confidentiality literature and the things I'm going to be talking about will be very North American based. With that being said, a lot of that will probably still translate over to you in the Emirates. But it's quite possible that you guys might have some institutional specifics or national specifics that may not be covered in this talk. So quiz question number 1. Randomization provides guarantees that 2 groups will remain prognostically balanced, true or false? Question number 2, blinding clinicians to whether patients are receiving active or placebo therapy can eliminate the risk of important co-interventions. True or false? Question number 3, blinding outcome assessors minimizes bias in the assessment of event rates. True or false? Question number 4, which of the following are ways to minimize publication bias? A, high quality and thorough literature reviews. B, check sources of great literature. C, check for language restrictions. D, none of the above. Or E, all of the above. Last question, which of the following factors are assessed by research ethics boards to assess the adequacy of the researcher's proposed measures for safeguarding information? A, type of information collected. B, purpose of the information used. C, risk to participants should the security of the data be breached. D, anticipated use of personal information. E, appropriate security safeguards for the information that is stored. F, which is selection A, B, and E. Or G, all of the above. So we'll start talking about blinding with a story. Specifically, we'll be going back into the 1700s in Austria, where a gentleman named Mesmer was quite popularized. Some of you may be familiar with the story. For those who aren't, I'll tell you a little bit about this gentleman. He felt as though that he could feel the magnetic resonance and magnetic waves that everyone exhibits, and that he could diagnose individuals' ailments and treat them just by manipulating their magnetic waves. He gained national acclaim in Austria and Vienna, but over time he lost favor and was residing in France and in Paris for the most part. He had a lot of big fans there because people really believed a lot of the things that he was doing. So to give you an example, he had purported to have treated individuals with hysterical blindness with his methods. Now, some of you may also recall Ben Franklin for many of the wonderful things that he's done. He was one of the academics at the time, but quite a bit older around then. So him, along with a few other academics, proposed an experiment. And really, this was one of the earlier sources of blinding in research. So what happened here was Mesmer sent one of his apprentices to show them their methods. And what their plan was to magnetize, so you will, if you will, a tree. And then they were going to have an observer determine which tree was magnetized based on the waves that the tree was exhibiting. So what Ben Franklin and their academic group did was they actually blindfolded the individual. It was an adolescent child here. And what they found was that the child, the further he got away from that specific tree is the more he thought he was getting closer to it, really showing that all of this was a whole bunch of nonsense. And around that time, Mesmer lost even more favor in France. Really, a lot of his stuff got debunked at that point in time. So that's a little bit of a fun example of blinding for you guys. And so why don't we get into the present day? So important things to keep in mind that if you blind properly, it really eliminates the possibility of conscious or unconscious bias, so unconscious differential administration of specific interventions to the treatment and control groups, okay? The really important part is sometimes blinding is not possible, right? So if you're testing drug A versus drug B in an ICU population, and for instance, it's a sedation trial, you can't not sedate somebody, so you have to use a different drug, right? So in that case, you have to document potential co-interventions, and that's where some of the gray area comes in, but always best that if you can blind, do so properly and use a placebo. So we'll talk a little bit about why blinding is specifically important. So this is a study published in the Journal of Neurology in 1994 about patients with MS. And what they did in this trial, in this study was, they had done a placebo-controlled randomized clinical trial examining a number of different therapies in patients with MS. The issue here is that some of the outcomes that they were assessing were not strictly objective, right? So a neurologist had to review these outcomes and determine whether or not it was a favorable outcome or it wasn't a favorable outcome. What they found was that when you have assessors who were not blinded, and so they knew which treatment the patients got, they felt that there was a positive effect of the treatment. Now, when you used blinded outcome assessors, that treatment effect, quote unquote, treatment benefit disappeared. So this is a really good modern day example of why it's important to blind individuals, right? So this is, shows you why blinding is really important. With that being said, the caveat being certain outcomes, for certain outcomes, blinding is not that important, and those are objective outcomes. So for instance, if the outcomes all cause mortality, blinding technically shouldn't have much of an effect there, because if someone's dead or if they're alive, it's an objective outcome, right? In the case of the MS example, it was a certain neurological symptoms and how people were doing. So there was a lot of area there to misinterpret the results. So a fun little study there for you from 1994. So in general, when you're blinding, and this source I'll document at the end of our talk is from the User's Guide to the Medical Literature by Dr. Cook, Dr. Gordon Guyatt, and Dr. Maureen Mead as well. So in general, if you can at all blind certain numbers of groups, the 5 groups that you should blind are patients, clinicians, data collectors, the adjudicators of the outcomes, as well as the data analysts. And over there, I'll leave you to read the rest of the slides to avoid certain biases there, but we'll keep on going with our talk, but you'll have this for reference. So real important study done by Dr. Devereux, as well as Dr. Guyatt and Dr. Bandari from McMaster University a number of years ago. This was published in JAMA. And what they wanted to see was the position interpretations and textbook definitions of blinding terminology in randomized controlled trials. So what they wanted to look at was to see, when studies say something is single blind or double blind or triple blind, is there some sort of consistency in this nomenclature? Much to their surprise, or maybe lack of their surprise, what they found was that they surveyed 90 physicians in 3 Canadian university hospitals, and they found 10, 17, and 15 different definitions or interpretations of single blind, double blind, or triple blind, right? And then they surveyed trialists who were purported experts of 18 different combinations of groups actually blinded, reported as double blind. So what this tells you is that the use of the word single blind, double blind, triple blind is something that probably shouldn't be used, because even when you look at experts, they don't have a unified definition of it. So what this slide is here to show you is that when you're designing your trial or when you're reading a study, it's really important for them to specify who's actually blinded, right? So it's better to say the patient and the physician and the data collectors were blinded as opposed to saying this was a triple blind study, because who was blinded if it's just a triple blind study? So this is where the details come in. So which groups can you potentially blind in RCTs? We talked a little bit about this already when I referenced the User's Guide to the Medical Literature table. So participants, healthcare providers, data collectors, outcome adjudicators, data analysts, and manuscript writers. And in fact, what's recommended is that if you're doing a study, if you're doing a randomized control trial, try to write 2 manuscripts before you even unblind the results, right? So you'll write one manuscript which would be a positive result, and the other manuscript for a negative result, so that you can be completely objective in your presentation of your results. And then when you end up figuring out which treatment group was specified to which group, then you can figure out which manuscript you want to use. And that's generally the way a lot of these trialists go about their research work. So always worthwhile to blind these groups. And when you do that, you avert bias in outcome ascertainment, bias in co-intervention, and bias in contamination. So these are all the reasons to blind. So then the question becomes, should we, how do we manage unblinding patients? How do we test for blinding? Should we be testing for blinding? So there certainly is a need to have in your protocol the means by which to unblind when necessary for patient safety. So if patients are not doing well, there should be a safety board as part of your trial or as part of your study to unblind when necessary for patient safety, right? So you need to have a system to ensure that this happens. However, you got to be careful that it only happens when it's needed, as opposed to it being done inappropriately to manipulate the trial. Furthermore, if you are using unblinding envelopes, this part's really important, because if it's not a well-designed envelope, people can easily look it up, put it up next to a light and see what the assignment is of that patient in the envelope. So if you're using envelopes, make sure they're sealed, make sure they're numbered, make sure they're opaque as well. Okay, and then at the end of the study, you want to get all the envelopes back, and you want to make sure that they remained unopened for the ones that weren't used. So should you test for blinding? So there's another study in the BMJ in 2004, and then some more recommendations from the Journal of Clinical Epidemiology as well in 2005, and then another study in 2007 with respect to this. So textbooks will tell you that yes, you should absolutely test for blinding. And initially, if you guys aren't familiar with the consort statement, this was a multi-group effort to try to standardize the way research is presented and the way research is done. So if you just Google consort checklist, they have a checklist for systematic reviews, they have a checklist for randomized controlled trials, just to make sure that we're presenting things in the right way so that it's easily interpretable and that it can be used by many individuals. So since about 2008, I believe, I could be off by a few years, they have removed the testing for blinding. There were a lot of people who were against this, but when you look at the systematic reviews, only 2 to 8% of RCTs from top journals actually test for blinding. And when they do the testing for blinding, they conclude that it's only successful about 50% of the time. So based on this, should we be testing for blinding at all? You know, part of the issue is that if you assume people sign up for a trial because they believe the new treatment is beneficial for them, so the people who do well are more likely to believe they got the treatment, and the people who do poorly are more likely to believe they got the old treatment or the placebo. So patients feel this way. It's also possible and highly likely that clinicians feel the same way as well. And we know from the previous literature that we just talked about briefly that blinding doesn't appear to work in quote unquote positive trials. So with all this in mind, should we actually be testing for blinding? So if asking the question, what did you receive is biased by belief, what should we ask? Is there a question we should be asking? Is it worthwhile asking? So what we suggest and what's been suggested by the experts is that what's perhaps better than quote unquote testing for blinding is to look for effects of unblinding. So you look for the intervention, co-intervention use. You look at a differential dropout rate in different arms. Are the patients in group A getting some more specific co-intervention than the patients in group B? Are more patients in group A dropping out? Is there a lot of cross-contamination from group A to group B? Those are the things that you need to look out for and are perhaps a more robust way to look at these things based on everything we've talked about. So that's blinding, but you can't talk about blinding without talking about placebos. So we're going to talk about placebos next, okay? So why should we use placebos, right? I'm going to give you guys a few seconds to think about this. So if there's no established active therapy, it's always wise to use a placebo. If you're blinding a study, and if you can, depending on the specific question you're asking, it's important if you're blinding a study to use a placebo as well. And if you want to isolate the unique effects of an active treatment, it's always a good idea to use a placebo. When would you consider selecting a placebo over an active comparator? I'll give you guys a few seconds to think about this. So this question is specifically asking if if you're, for instance, comparing two antiplatelet agents, when would it be okay to select a placebo over an older antiplatelet agent for coronary artery disease, for example? So if you have no established effective therapy, it's always wise to use a placebo. If the patients won't take the established effective therapy or cannot take it, you can use a placebo. Or if it's an add-on, if it's an adjunct to your established effective therapy. So let's talk a little bit more about placebo effect. So placebo effect can happen for many reasons, right? It can happen because of natural history of illness. It could be because of other treatments. It could be because of expectation bias of the investigator. The patients can think they're having some sort of treatment or not. So if you're not having any effect of the medication, that patients might feel as though I probably have a placebo, right? So all of these things this placebo effect can be recognized. So there's different types of placebo to consider. So a traditional placebo is when there's no accepted established effective therapy. Furthermore, you have things like attention placebo, which is used in social interventions, right? You can also have an add-on placebo, which is when you have an established therapy that works through a different pathway. So you take that therapy and you add a placebo on top of that. You could also have double dummy interventions. So if you're comparing an oral and an IV drug, you can have two different types of placebos there. Furthermore, you can also have an active placebo, which is used sometimes, because if you give somebody a placebo and they have and the patients feels as though they're not having any effects, they might feel that they have a placebo. But if you use an active placebo, which gives you a little bit of a side effect, the patients are less likely to think that they have the placebo, further preserving the integrity of your study and your results. So other relevant factors to consider for your placebo: you want the placebo and the experimental intervention to appear indistinguishable. So, I mean, if they're tablets, you want to make sure they're the same kind of, so they look like the same tablet. If they're a drug and they're clear, you want to make sure that the placebo is also clear, right? The other thing, which is a bit harder in surgery, is that when they do sham procedures, sometimes what they would do in these studies is they would make the initial incision for patients to make them think that they had the procedure, but then they wouldn't actually have it. And you also want to make sure that the drugs look, taste, smell, and feel the same way. And perhaps one of the more important things is that you want to actually test this placebo before you start the trial, so that you can overcome the hiccups that are likely to come with any large-scale study. Another thing to keep in mind is packaging these drugs. So if you can, it's always a good idea to try to obtain these drugs and devices from the manufacturer. Oftentimes, they'll give it to you at a discounted rate or for free, given that you're studying their equipment and that it's going to be in a study that may end up being beneficial for their company. Furthermore, you want an approved facility to do the packaging, and you also want to adhere to regulatory standards for key required information on labels as well. So you want to keep things as structured as possible. And you also want to keep the treatment regimen simple, because you want to avoid complexity with intervention. You don't want to have a complex flow chart of like, oh, if A, then do B, and if B, then do E. That makes things really complicated for design and also for placebo management. So let's talk a little bit briefly about sham surgical procedure. So this is a trial done in the New England Journal of Medicine in 2002, which is a controlled trial of arthroscopic surgery for osteoarthritis of the knee. So what they did, my apologies. What they did in this study was they wanted to see if the placebo controls in the evaluation of the surgery had any benefit. So this was a study done by Dr. Wardalowska, who's a research fellow, and Dr. Carr was a professor of orthopedic surgery. So what they found with these quote unquote sham surgical procedures was that 53 trials were included, where they evaluated proper surgery versus ones that weren't actual real surgery. And in this, they found that 74% of the trials documented improvement in the sham arm. So they didn't actually have any surgery, but the patients felt an improvement. And 51% of the trials showed no difference between the sham and the surgery outcomes. Also, importantly, they found that with respect to serious adverse events, 34% of the trials in the placebo group reported them, and 41% in the intervention arm. And most of the adverse events were unrelated to the intervention. So super interesting that when you blind patients to some of these surgical procedures, they're finding a benefit even though nothing was actually done. So all the more reasons to blind, and showing the power of blinding as well. So summarize blinding and the placebos that we've talked about. So you have to consider the relevance of blinding. Placebos are helpful, but not always possible. And if they're not possible, you want to try to select really objective outcomes and try to make sure that you don't have any co-interventions. You want to plan your packaging, distribution, and supplying sites just for optimizing your success and to keep within your budget. And you also want to consider strategies to maintain your protocol and treatment adherence. So now that we've talked about blinding, we have two more sections to go. We have bias and confidentiality. Blinding by far was the largest one. So why don't we go into bias next? So what is bias? And how is it different from, say, random error, right? So random error is just that it's random, right? Bias is a systemic deviation from the underlying truth. So if you're studying, if they're in studies of treatment or harm, bias leads to either an underestimate or an overestimate of the underlying benefit or harm. All this is why it's really important to be able to recognize bias, even when it's not explicitly stated, because it really changes your interpretation of the study. So this is a table from the User's Guide to the Medical Literature that I've talked about before. It's a manual made by Dr. Guy, Dr. Cook, Dr. Mead, and a whole bunch of other methodologists. And what they really talk about is that when you're, how biases and interventions is if you don't pre-select your population, if you don't randomize properly, right? If your intervention and control groups are different from the beginning, you're asking for trouble. So a good way to look at this is that every study nowadays, any randomized controlled trial is going to have a table 1, a baseline characteristics table. So always take a look at the age and the comorbidities, just to make sure that both the groups are prognostically balanced right from the start, right? And then next, you want to look at how the intervention and control groups may become different as the study proceeds, right? Perhaps study in the patient in the intervention group may receive more effective additional medication that's not really the one that's being studied. So you really want to be mindful of co-interventions there. And finally, you also want to make sure that you're not losing too many patients to follow-up. You know, if your placebo group loses a lot of patients to follow-up, you might not necessarily have the most robust results. You want to make sure that things are as equal as possible in both arms. So selection bias specifically, right? So selection bias is when selecting specific patients results in a sample group which is not actually random and is not representative of a population. So you want to avoid this by randomizing selection. So I'll give you an example of this. Many papers in the United States have a heavily Caucasian population as part of their studies. And that may not necessarily translate well over to the African-American subset of the population or the Hispanic members of the population, right? If 90% of your MI trials or your stroke trials are all based on Caucasian patients, that stuff's not really transferable to other patients. So, you know, you're selecting a specific group of patients. And again, it may work well for those subset of patients, but not for the others. Another example of this is the use of hormone replacement therapy. Early on, multiple observational trials indicated that hormone replacement therapy reduced the rate of coronary artery disease. However, when they studied this in a randomized fashion, they found the opposite. They found that a hormone replacement therapy actually increased the rate of coronary artery disease. So the difference was likely explained by the fact that the women who were on, for the initial observational study, the women who were in that trial were more dedicated to their health, self-selecting into the hormone replacement group in the observational trials. That's likely what caused that effect, right? And then when you randomize it properly, you found the true effect. So let's talk about detection bias. So detection bias is observations in the treatment group are pursued more diligently than the control group. This can be avoided by blinding. So to give you an example here, perhaps the examiners are really familiar with the symptom profile of a specific cancer medication, so that when they assess the patients, they already know this is the old medication that they're taking. And then they may subconsciously act differently towards those patients who didn't show the same patterns, right? So this is a really good reason why you should be blinding individuals, including the assessors. Observer bias is when the observer makes subjective decisions about the outcome. So a couple of things. So this part of this is similar to the MS example that I told you guys before, where if you don't blind the observer, and the outcome for the MS patients was not specifically objective, right? It was a symptom profile, so it ended up being subjective. So there was an observer bias there. However, when you blinded them, that bias disappeared. The other thing that you can do is also have an objective outcome if you can. So things like mortality would be an objective outcome, right? Or like mechanical ventilation-free days if you're doing an ICU level study, because if they're not intubated, they're not intubated. And that's an objective outcome. Recall bias. So this is when patients know whether they were allocated to the treatment group or the control groups, and this discolors the reporting of their symptoms. So for example, a cancer patient may remember more exposures in their life that they consider quote unquote toxic, but they forget about the many other life experiences that they had that could have actually contributed to their malignancy diagnosis. Similarly, a cancer patient may be more likely to remember their visit to a nuclear power plant than a person without cancer. So all the more reason. So if you blind the patients, this is less likely to happen. A response bias. So patients enroll themselves in the trial, which results in a non-representative sample. So for example, the people who respond to a survey will frequently be different from those people who choose to ignore the survey. I'm sure many of you get a whole bunch of surveys, and I promise you not many of you are responding back, and the people who respond back are always the same people responding back, right? So that's a bit of a response bias. So how you do this is you randomly sample the population. Harder to do for survey studies, to be honest with you. So publication bias. I wanted to spend some time talking about this because it's becoming more and more relevant today with COVID-19. So what is publication bias? The general principle is that negative studies are less likely to be published. By that, I mean, if you're comparing one therapy to another, and the results are equivocal, individuals are less likely to get that published, journals are less likely to publish them, unfortunately. This form of bias leads to the selection of mostly positive studies out in the literature. So if you were to do a meta-analysis, you would end up with a mostly positive meta-analysis. One of the ways you can look out for this is by constructing funnel plots to identify publication bias. There's also, funnel plots alone shouldn't be used for this, but funnel plots is one of the ways you can do. There's also other statistical techniques like the Eggers test, which I think is outside the scope of this specific grand rounds. So you can avoid publication bias by contacting relevant authors, requesting unpublished trial data, searching for publications in multiple languages, checking multiple, performing a search in multiple cross-specialty databases just to make sure that you're getting everything and trying to get all of that great literature. And I'm going to show you guys some examples. So this is another paper from the BMJ where they talk about how to examine and interpret funnel plot asymmetry and meta-analysis. So in general, you need at least 10 studies to be able to do a funnel plot asymmetry analysis. And this is what it looks like. So the line, you see the line at 1 with a solid line vertically going up and down. That's the line of no difference, and anything to the left of that would show an effect, and anything to the right of that would show an effect as well. So a funnel plot is what you're looking at right now with the triangle that's formed by the dotted lines. So what you want to make sure in this is that the outer dashed lines indicate the triangular region with which 95% of studies are expected to lie in the absence of both biases and heterogeneity. Okay, the solid vertical line that we talked about is the no intervention effect. So this is an example of a forest plot, of a funnel plot that does not show a publication bias. So, lately you're seeing a lot of meta-analyses come out that are not being done well, in particular about ivermectin by individuals who aren't, don't have methodologies as part of their group in COVID-19. So if you were to look at some of those meta-analyses, I promise you, not many of them have done funnel plots or Eggers tests. And if they have done funnel plots, you can feel free to look at them and you'll see that there definitely is a publication bias. There aren't very many negative studies published about that drug. That's just one of the many problems with that, but just wanted to highlight that specific example. So to summarize a little bit about biases, there are some tables here. Again, this is from the user's guide to the medical literature that I'll leave here for you guys to read yourself, but just very briefly, you could have a source of bias from the treatment and control of patients, and the way you alleviate that is by randomizing patients and matching them as best as you can with stratification. And then as the study proceeds, you want to make sure that you're avoiding biases arising from placebo effects or co-interventions by blinding the patients as well as the caregivers. And specifically when it comes to bias in assessment of outcome, you want to make sure that the individuals assessing the outcome are also blinded. Another thing to keep in mind, you want to make sure that to reduce the bias, you want to ensure loss to follow-up is very minimal. You want to make sure that studies are not being stopped early. You want to complete the study as initially planned. You want to make sure that you're not omitting, you want to omit patients who did not receive the assigned treatment. You want to avoid those things, right? You want to adhere to intention to treat principle and include all patients in the arm to which they're randomized, right? That's the whole intention to treat principle, which is the gold standard by which we do studies. So now that we've talked about the summary for biases, we're going to go briefly into confidentiality. So I think most individuals, most of you will know what this means. Confidentiality, the purpose is to protect the privacy of all persons. You want to build trust, not only with the study participants, but with the greater community at large. And you want to maintain ethical standards and integrity of the research process. What I have listed in this slide is a tri-council policy statement, which we in Canada have to complete in order to be conducting studies such as randomized controlled trials. So I have the link there for you there. There's a whole tutorial and it's a free course and you can complete it and get a certificate as well. And it goes through exactly what the requirements are with respect to maintaining confidentiality as part of a research study. So briefly, there's a few categories that need to be mindful of. So directly underlying information, indirectly identifying information, encoded information. So to give you an example, like you don't, ideally, if you're saving data points, you don't want to have the patient's names there. It's not really relevant. So that would be directly underlying information. Indirectly identifying information would be, say, someone's date of birth. If you don't need that information, you shouldn't be collecting it or just coding it somehow. So if you're coding information to say, an individual's initials are being used, you want to make sure that you're the way your coding password is safely secured so that it's not easily accessible and people just can't access these things, right? Ideally, you would have anonymous information. That's the easiest way to protect participants, through the use of anonymous or anonymized data. But we understand that that's not always possible. So just something to keep in mind and something to address when you're writing your protocols or when you're writing your research ethics, when you're submitting to your research ethics boards for review, that you want to have thought about all these things and that you have a plan to address any issues that may arise. So, I don't want to get into too much into confidentiality because I think there's a lot of specifics that we've briefly talked about. And I think visiting the Tri-Council policy statement on the website link that I provided is a really good idea. And I think if you have some time, it's really valuable to go through that website and get your certificate. So this is a paper from the BMJ talking about the sharing and reuse of individual participant data from clinical trials. And what they talk about here is, in addition to what we've already talked about, is not just saving data responsibly and getting appropriate consent from patients, but it's also about data sharing for the next study. So this would be something good to review if you guys are planning on performing, say, individual patient data meta-analyses down the line. It's really important to think about all of these steps before you start your first study so that you can have all of your ducks in a row so that you don't encounter any issues or minimize the number of issues you're going to encounter moving forward. So that's all I have for you guys today. The references throughout the talk have been listed with the specific studies that I've quoted. These two books, particularly the one on the left, I highly recommend. So this is the user's guide to the medical literature, where a lot of the tables that were in this study, that were in this talk, are from. I think it's a very high yield book, particularly for individuals who are interested in critical appraisal or performing high level research. The one on the right is the Cochrane Handbook for Systematic Reviews of Interventions. This is also another valuable resource. And again, the Tri-Council policy statement on confidentiality is also a very valuable resource. So with all of that, I just wanted to thank you for your time and attention. And again, feel free to email me at sameer.sharif@medportal.ca if you guys have any specific questions. My Twitter handle is there at the top left. If you guys are on Twitter, I'm happy to answer questions over there as well. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Dr. Sameer. That was an excellent overview on the nitty-gritty details of bias and blinding, along with the importance of confidentiality in research. The first step definitely in avoiding bias is to identify it, and like a thorough understanding of different kinds of bias at every phase of our study is important to help prevent prejudiced consideration of the research question, definitely. So up next, we have a very important lecture on ethics delivered today by Dr. Omar Ghazanfar. Dr. Ghazanfar is an emergency physician at the Cleveland Clinic Abu Dhabi. Prior to joining CCAD, Dr. Ghazanfar was an EM physician at the Zayed Military Hospital in Abu Dhabi. He has completed his MBBS from Karachi University, Pakistan, and subsequently worked for 13 years in the UK before moving to the United Arab Emirates in 2015 as an EM physician. His subspecialty interest lies in disaster medicine, and he has completed the Advanced Masters in Disaster Medicine, EMDM, from the University of del Piemonte at Italy and the Vrije University, Brussels. He has also completed a fellowship from Oxford in appraisals and performance management before working for NHS England in an advisory role. He was co-chair of trauma at the Zayed Military Hospital, an associate editor of the Emirates Society of Emergency Medicine newsletter, as well as author to several book chapters in emergency medicine. Dr. Ghazanfar has a keen interest in medical leadership, having completed the Edward Jenner Leadership degree from the NHS Leadership Academy with a position as Fellow of the Institute of Leadership Management, UK. He's a member of the IFEM NATSIG committee looking at the use of technology in EM, as well as a member of disaster medicine at the European Society of Emergency Medicine. He was also recently appointed to the IFEM Research Committee. Welcome, Dr. Ghazanfar.
Hi, good morning. My name is Dr. Omar Ghazanfar, and thank you for having me on board as faculty for ECREM BEAM collaboration in setting up the research curriculum. So I'm going to talk about a couple of topics today. The first one is navigating the IRB. So what is an institutional review board? Is it an ethics committee? What does the IRB do? So it basically reviews, approves, and monitors any human subject research to ensure that it's safe. It identifies the rights of the patients as well as the welfare of the subjects are protected. IRBs are also tasked to determine the degree and likelihood of risk from any research. Minimum risk, so the probability and magnitude of harm or discomfort anticipated are not greater than those which would normally be encountered in daily life or during routine physical or psychological examination or tests. So is it minimal or is it greater than minimal? So that is the risk likelihood which an IRB has to determine as well. So what's a criteria for an IRB approval? So number one, the risks to subjects are minimized as much as possible. The risks to subjects are reasonable in relation to whatever the anticipated benefits are for the intervention. The informed consent or the written consent is adequate. Where appropriate, the research plan should make provisions for the safety of the subjects during the data collection process. Where appropriate, there are adequate provisions to protect the privacy of subjects and maintain confidentiality of data. So in essence, information governance. And appropriate safeguards are included within the study to protect the rights and welfare of any vulnerable subjects. So how does the IRB determine approval? There has to be a criteria for approval. The risks to subjects are minimized. Risks are reasonable in relation to benefits. It's equitable subject selection. Adequate protections to protect the privacy and confidentiality of the project. Additional safeguards for any subjects which are from the vulnerable classes, and consult which needs to be sought as well as documented. Why have an IRB? So basically an IRB is established to protect the rights and welfare of human subjects. There have been multiple previous incidents of unethical research that have harmed human subjects, which has led to government regulations for establishing legal protections. So risks versus benefits. So risks are, is it a psychological risk, legal, economic, physical, is it because of privacy? And then benefits could be educational, individual patient-based, scientific, or social. So the risk-benefit scale is very important to see if the risks outweigh the benefits or vice versa. So a bit of history. We'll all know about the Nuremberg Code. So it resulted from a US military tribunal of German physicians who had conducted inhuman experiments during World War II on captives. From this, we derive requirements for voluntary participation, documented consent, and proof that that benefits must outweigh risks to subjects. So there's another report which came out called the Belmont Report, and the key concepts from the Belmont Report were it has to have respect. Any project has to have respect for persons, beneficence, and justice. So the first principle is respect for persons. So individuals should be treated as autonomous agents. Persons with diminished autonomy are entitled to protection. And the consent has to be informed. Subjects, to the degree that they are capable, must be given the opportunity to choose what shall or shall not happen to them. So they have the right to choose. The elements of informed consent are information. So the right information is given. The right information is comprehended by the subject, and the fact that the subject accepts this voluntarily. So the second principle is beneficence. So human subjects should not be harmed. Research should maximize possible benefits and minimize possible harms. So the nature and scope of risk benefits must be assessed in a systematic manner to assess the risk benefits of the research at hand. And the third principle is justice. So the benefits and risks of research must be distributed fairly. So this means that it should not be available for the entire population, not just for a subgroup. The selection of subjects have to be fair in terms of the procedures and outcomes and how they are selected as well. So there are various types of IRB reviews with the various types of timetables. So some IRBs, some research projects are exempt. They still require a reviewer. So at least one reviewer, expect at least 5 working days from the first business day after receipt of proposal. Expedited would be requires 2 reviewers, expect proposal to be working days from the time of receipt to about 10 days. And full requires a full ethical committee review, expecting about 20 days from the types of proposal. Now, these are just arbitrary timelines. Each institute and research organization may well have their own way of conducting an IRB review, and they may have different timetables. But this is just one example of an IRB review timetable. Everything scrutinized based on risk categories. Exempt categories should include minimal risk, includes research like surveys, interviews, classroom research. Does not mean exempt from submitting a review. Most are approved less than a week. Expedited are minimum risk, some sensitive topic, low risk studies, prisoners, minors, low risk clinical studies. They may be studied by the IRB chair or qualified IRB member. Most, if approved, will be done within the first couple of weeks. And a full board review means it's more than the minimal risk. It includes invasive procedures, for example, or a drug intervention. So they have to be discussed during a board meeting. A vote is taken to either approve or deny. And only a full board can deny approval, which means that there has the board meeting, when it happens, has to have full quorum. So definitions of human subject research. It's a systematic research, a systematic investigation, including research, development, testing, and evaluation, designed to develop or contribute to generalizable knowledge. And a human subject is an individual about whom an investigator is conducting research, which data is obtained through an intervention or an interaction with the individual or an identifiable piece of private information. How do you write a protocol document? So contextualize and bring together all aspects of the research for the IRB, a roadmap for everything else, outline the work conducted for research, describe all aspects of your project consistently, avoid any jargon or short form, write clearly, plainly, using charts, grids, diagrams, whatever will help in your project. When describing procedures, don't be too vague, don't be too specific, so it needs to be generalized, and find the right mix. Then the consent form is the most important. Make sure it's done clearly documented. Make sure it documents all the risks and the benefits. So there are a number of templates available. You don't need to use templates. You need to use anything which is available in terms of your own organization. So it has to be done appropriately. And we know of many researches which got close to publishing, but the consent process was not done properly, and the research had to stop. Do I need signed consent? So studies that meet certain criteria don't always require signed consent. So if, for example, participants are 18 or older and they've got reasonable, they have corpus mentis and they have all agreed, or there is no identifying information collected, or there's a one-time survey or individual interview. Most other such studies and most research studies will actually do require signed consent. These include focus group studies that involve minors, which require parental consent, request to use grades, non-research data, biomedical procedures, etc. Tips for an easy review: keep things clear. It shouldn't be guesswork. Keep it as simple. Don't discuss epidemiology, epidemiology in your protocol or consent. Describe what you'll be doing in simple, clear terms. Submit a complete proposal and a protocol. Do not submit half questions. Submit all your study instruments and materials. Do a comprehensive literature review and review everything before submitting it to the IRB. Exempt review. So after reading descriptions of the following conditions and you believe you qualify for exempt review, it does not mean you do not need to submit a proposal. Even a IRB, which is a research which is IRB exempt, still needs to have an IRB approval. So and the IRB has to grant exempt status. It means you do not have to report and follow up requirements as you would do with an expedited or full review. However, it still is the IRB's decision to make the final determination about the research status of a proposal, whether it can be exempt, whether expedited or full. So the expedited review category is for research that involves no more than minimal risk to subjects, in which only the human involvement will be in one of the categories listed in the following slides. The IRB chair and at least 2 members conduct the review. Expedited reviews may be appropriate for requests of minor changes in, for example, previously approved research during period of which approval has previously been authorized. And a full review is when 2 members of the IRB determine a research proposal require more than a minimal risk to subjects, and it does not fall within the expedited review category. The proposal is then referred to the IRB for a full review. And in such cases, the researcher may be required to submit additional information necessary to perform the risk-benefit analysis. In any full review involving case research that places human subjects at more than minimal risk, a series of safeguards must be in place to ensure research participants will have full understanding of the procedures prior to giving consent. The IRB will want to ensure that risks to human subjects are minimized, as well as risk to subjects should be deemed reasonable in relation to anticipated benefits. If any subjects or 2 subjects, and the importance of knowledge that may be reasonably expected to be gained from that research. Many online resources are available which can give you some idea about how the various IRB processes work. So everything's available online. Confidentiality versus anonymity. So this is from the Arizona State University. It basically means that confidentiality means the research can identify the responses of the individual. However, research make every effort to make sure anyone outside the projects cannot connect individuals with their responses. Anonymous means that either project does not collect identifying information of individual subjects, or the project cannot link individual responses with participants, completely anonymous. So how do you protect anonymities? Confidentiality is to limit identifying patient identifiers or subject identifiers. If you are collecting names for prizes or compensation, use a separate sheet. Always link data with the anonymous reproducible ID instead of actual names. International research, what expertise do you have to conduct research in that location? What languages will be used if you're using it in different languages, not in English? Are you using a collaboration with a local institute? Are risks benefits different? What's the local age? What's the local cultural sensitivities? Any issues with regards to autonomy? Is it culturally appropriate? Does the local, the investigator know what the local laws and regulations are with respect to research? So I think there's a lots to take home from this small presentation. I'll be happy to answer questions. Alternatively, you can email me and we can have a further discussion. Thank you. Hi, my name is Dr. Omar Ghazanfar. This is my second presentation for the day. It's a little bit shorter than the previous one, but it's quite important. It's not just about research, it's a life lesson as well. It's talking about equality, diversity, and inclusion, what it means, and why is it important in not only in research, but also in day-to-day life as well, in terms of when you work through your residency program and when you're working later on in your career as a consultant specialist, etc. So what is equality? What is diversity? What is inclusion? So the statement made by Dr. Nicole Kanicki, is the Director of Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion in Research and Innovation at the University of Toronto. So EDI is the understanding and acknowledgement that historical inequality has led to cultural inequity, that diversity through intersectional representation is a necessary element of research success, and that inclusive practice will benefit all in the Canadian and global research environment. So although he said this in Canada, it's applicable to research and work pretty much everywhere across the world. And why is it important in research? It provides diversity of perspective and thought. It provides creative and innovative research outputs. It provides an inclusive and welcoming research environment for trainees which come from an underrepresented class. and increased generalizability of research impact to global communities. So what this basically means is that you're doing a research in Canada or the US, it has to have some impact in underrepresented areas in Africa or Asia where they're coming from third world countries, poor economies. So the impact should be discernible with across the world, not just for one specific class of people or individuals because of their affluence or because of their geography. So what is diversity? What is inclusion? What is an inclusive environment? What is primary and secondary dimensions of diversity? Why does diversity matter? How do we embrace your diversity, etc.? So these are a number of topics which I don't think we can all cover in just a 10 to 12-minute lectures. I'll try and provide as much information as possible. But then we can have a discussion later on via email or social media if you want to have further inputs about what this entails. So diversity is essential. It maintains excellence in research as well as in creations, in artistry. It provides a learning and engaging environment, and it provides community and staff engagement. It tends to attract and retain diverse students who would normally not come, diverse faculty and staff. You have to respect and appreciate cultures within the multiple perspectives from where you're working, where the research is being conducted. It promotes equity and success for all. It prepares students and researchers to act ethically in relation to diversity in local and as well as global communities. And it addresses important ideas of racism and oppression and all forms of neglect and discrimination throughout the campus, at work, in research projects, during your residency, and after you've become trained as a physician. So what is diversity? Diversity encompasses all differences that make us unique. They include, but not limited to, race, color, ethnicity, language, nationality, sexual orientation, religion, gender, socioeconomic status, age, and physical and mental ability. So one of Maya's mentions, diversity is being invited to the party and inclusion is being asked to dance. So I'll give you a very good example. So I have been working in various places in the world. So I worked in Pakistan where I trained, I worked in the UK, and I'm working in the UAE. So I've worked in very diverse cultures, diverse because of race, religion, because of color, because of language, but I've never been felt excluded. So I was always included in jokes. When I moved to the UAE, I couldn't understand Arabic, so I made an effort to learn Arabic. And so I was included in jokes, not in my own language. So I think that's some of the onus is on the individual as well, and some of the onus is on people to include people who are coming and working and doing research projects from diverse environments and different cultures, religion, and languages. So diversity is, what is it? It's a representation of different types of people: gender, race, ability, religion, language. It often focuses on the differences and is referred to as the mix. Inclusion is the deliberate act of welcoming diversity and creating an environment where all kinds of different people can thrive and then succeed. Inclusion is making this mix work. Diversity is what you have, and inclusion is what you do with it. Simply having a diverse group of people working within a team, research project, classroom, program is not enough. Everyone should feel safe, should be engaged, should participate, share, and be on equal footing as everyone else. What are the primary dimensions of diversity? It's what we are born with. That's the primary dimension: your religion, your socioeconomic status, gender, age, religion, culture, disability. Whereas the secondary dimensions are which can change throughout our life: families, you get married, you have children, school, neighborhood, friends, prejudices. Your value system is basically at the core of all of this. So why does diversity matter? Basically, you're interacting with people from different groups. It's very important to have a diverse workforce with different cultural backgrounds because it promotes creativity. It promotes research. It promotes people working together from a wide, varied backgrounds. You're working with employees, employers, co-workers, and customers from all across the world. It increases our own knowledge base. It promotes creative thinking and research, self-awareness, and it enriches multiple perspectives. What is culture? So culture is language. It's religion. It's how you raise your kids. It's what food you eat, what music you listen to, what kind of celebration. Is it Eid? Is it Holi? Is it Christmas? Jokes, etc. Why is it important, and why you should be aware of it, and how we can achieve and assess cultural awareness. So those are questions which need to go home. You need to take all these questions home with you and see what you can do with them. So what is culture? So it's patterns of human behavior common to groups, includes communication, languages, practices and beliefs, value systems, customs, courtesies, rituals. How do you interact with people, relationships, institutions. Groups are based on variety of things as well, race, which ethnic background you come from, gender, what's your gender, what's your religion, sexual orientation, social group, and so on. So this is how culture is. Culture is quite diverse as well. What's cultural diversity in the workplace? So cultural diversity in the workplace, it provides strength. It challenges individuals to respond to their work environment especially when they're working with people coming from varied backgrounds. It's how you value an individual and how you value cultural differences within a work group, within a program, within a research project, so able to organize yourself and then reach the organization goals as well. So what is cultural awareness? Know your own background, recognize what your own stereotypes and biases are, gain knowledge of cultural history and heritage, be aware of other people's perceptions, and recognize the effect of nepotism and what it can have on other parts of your team. Embrace diversity, embraces the richness of differences. It recognizes that all groups have contributed, not just in the American society, I'm talking about everywhere else, how diversity has led to growth and strength in economy. When we look at the UAE, the local population works hand in hand with the majority of people who are expats, and it's thriving. Resistance to value differences. So why do you want to change? There's a fear of change. There's a lack of information and limited exposure to members of other groups. I mean, I still get messages from people across the UK, or are you, what kind of regime, where are you living in? Is it okay? Is it safe? Actually, I keep telling them, this is the safest place I've lived in my life. I've never felt more comfortable. So, you have discomfort with differences. You have a desire to return to the good old days. So that's just various thoughts people might have when they have some resistance to valuing change and differences. So it's a very, very vast topic. It's very difficult to discuss in one day. I think it's very important to have as part of your growth, both when you're getting to start off working on a research project, or whether it's working on a daily work, your workflow, when you see patients, because patients are coming from diverse backgrounds as well. So you have to make sure that you are part of ensuring that you're valuing differences, you're valuing opinions from people who might have worked in different cultures. It's very important to be able to live, in this current day and age, world's a very small place. Again, as I said, it's a complete, so ethics, equality, diversity, inclusion, IRB, they're all hand in hand with each other. When you're asked to do a project, you'll be asked to see, some of the IRB requirements might be that you have to do an equality and diversity module. When I started working in the UK, they're actually, as part of their pre-course induction or working in the UK, equality and diversity module was a mandated part of what you need to do before you actually could start working in the UK. In fact, when I started doing my own dissertation a couple of years ago, I was asked by the IRB whether I've done equality and diversity training. So I think that's quite important for all young researchers when they start doing research projects, just to make sure that you've done equality and diversity training as well. There's a lot of modules available online. Some of them are free, some of them might be provided to you by your own institution. So just have a look at those, because those are very important. And often they may be part of the IRB process as well. So thank you. And ECREM has my email details. So I'm happy to answer any questions later on if required as well. Thank you and have a good day.
Thank you, Dr. Ghazanfar, for that informative lecture. I'm sure the audience was just as interested as we were with the concept of EDI in research, and the tips that you gave us for an easy IRB review will also come in exceptionally helpful when we're moving forward with our own submissions to our own respective committees. So now that we've concluded the video sessions, we're going to start moving to our live Q&A segment. So Tasneem is going to help us a little bit with technical issues. And can I please request both our speakers, Dr. Sameer and Dr. Omar, to kindly switch on their microphones and videos. And for the audience, please feel free to type in any questions related to the topics discussed in the chat box, and Sania and I will read them out to the speakers.
Okay, so we have our first question. So it's for Dr. Sameer. A common error young researchers do is that they use the term blinding and concealment interchangeably, right? So although these words have the same meaning literally, but in terms of research, they refer to like entirely different things. So what's the difference, like the practical difference between blinding and allocation concealment, Dr. Sameer?
Thanks for that question. Blinding is the literal act of, for instance, the patient not knowing what treatment they're getting, and ideally the provider not knowing what treatment arm they're in, whether they're getting placebo or treatment, for an example. Allocation and concealment, on the other hand, starts well before blinding. So that's the process where when you come up with the bones of your trial, you ideally have opaque sealed envelopes and you already know which treatment arm the next patient's going to go in. So when you have allocation and concealment, what that means is the person who's assigning people into those arms doesn't even know what arm they're supposed to be in. So that's what that means. So that even happens before the blinding even begins. So allocation concealment starts beforehand. It's more about what arm people are going to go into. And then blinding is the fact of me as a patient, I don't know what treatment I'm going to get, whether it's going to be A or B. That makes sense.
Yep. Thank you for the clarification, Dr. Sameer. Our next question is for Dr. Omar. So many junior researchers are easily frustrated by the process of applying for the IRB review, not to mention any follow-up or back and forth that happens. So in your experience, what can be done to expedite or streamline this process?
Thank you. That's an interesting question. First of all, let me just say I sounded terrible on the lecture. I was 3 days into COVID, so I didn't sound very well. So apologies for that for people who couldn't understand me. I'm still in quarantine.
No.
So that's quite an interesting question. And I think it's quite important that people, when they're applying for a research project, realize early on in the end what an IRB is and whether an IRB is required. I've had people come across to me to say that the IRB is exempt, so we don't need to apply for an IRB, and I think that's not quite true. So even if you have an IRB exempt research project, whether it's a survey or a questionnaire or something, it still has IRB requirements. So it still needs to go to the IRB board. So the other error I've seen people do is that they've done an IRB at institution A, but they're also involved in institution B and C, and they all come under, for example, the umbrella of the Department of Health. But what people don't realize is that each individual facility, if you're doing research in one specific facility, doesn't mean it encompasses the same IRB process in the other facility. So you need to be aware of the fact that although you might have got IRB approval in your first or parent organization, you still need IRB for other organizations as well. The other thing which I found on a practical note is when you're actually going and doing an IRB approval or an IRB, look at the IRB forms. They're quite comprehensive in terms of what their requirements are. I think, as I mentioned in one of my lectures, one of the requirements for doing an IRB from my own perspective was to do a separate module on data governance and as well as EDI, so equality and diversity. And that is one of the first questions they've asked in my own IRB approval, to say, have you done the EDI module? Have you done your data governance module? Have you done your CGP module? So I think those are things which are, those things cannot be missed. So if you've been asked to do certain things as part of your IRB, I think it needs to be done. So if you can't miss those things. Then the other thing which I would say is make it simple. Clearly, you're not doing an IRB approval, you're not putting your research manuscript in front of the ethics board. So it needs to be clear. It needs to be very comprehensive. It might be somebody who is sitting in the panel who has nothing to do with your specialty at all or your project, and he's just there on the basis of his qualifications or his expertise in ethics. So I think it's very important to judge what each individual IRB is in each individual facility. gauge your and guide your IRB writing up or protocols depending on what the requirements for the organization are, and make sure the mandatory training requirements for each individual organization, whether it's an EDI, whether it's a CGC module, just make sure you do it. Otherwise, you might just get your IRB rejected based on these simple things which could have been done or prevented.
Absolutely. Thank you, Dr. Ahmed, for that.
Okay, so we have another question. This is for Dr. Sameer. So some degree of bias is nearly always present in a published study, and hence, that can potentially affect study results. What is your advice to young researchers on this aspect?
That's a good question. Yeah, no, I think you're right. There is always going to be some bias potentially in all of the studies, that in many of the studies you're going to do. I think the way to get around that is, first, when you are designing your study, you try to minimize all sources of bias and are explicit in how you're going to do that, and you can do that in your protocol. You can be vigilant when you're actually conducting your study to avoid further biases. And then when you're actually writing up your manuscript, like a lot of these eminent researchers do, is they write 2 manuscripts, I was saying in the talk, without unblinding the results. They write a positive manuscript and a negative study manuscript. And then that's really an objective way to address the biases, because you don't really know what the results are. You're assuming if it's positive, these are the biases and how they could have influenced things, or if they're negative, things are going to be in that way. So it starts from the beginning. It starts from planning about it, talking about it, and then when it actually happens, addressing it thoughtfully in your discussion, and saying which way that could have potentially skewed your results. And I'm just going to say one more thing unrelated to this question. A lot of the lectures that we're going to provide here, including the ones by Sunil, Andrew, and Raheem from Beam and everybody else, seem like really abstract topics that can be really hard to grasp, because research is not easy to grasp. So don't be surprised if it takes you several reads to get all of this stuff down. I think the best way to learn this stuff is to actually do research. So I think if it's something that you're interested in, it's probably better to actually do research, and it doesn't really matter any kind of research, because then you're going to get experience, you're going to learn from your mistakes, and then all of this stuff is going to start making a lot more sense. So just a little plug to say, I know this can seem overwhelming and very different from day-to-day clinical work.
You're absolutely right, Doctor.
Yeah, I totally agree. Even like multiple reads from when I was a PGY1 to now, with every read, with every different research project, with different courses, listening to different videos, we learn different aspects of the same topic. And like you mentioned, yeah, it might seem abstract, but it will all start making sense once we actually are involved in any project. Yeah. Thank you, Dr. Sameer.
All right, so our last question is for Dr. Ghazanfar. You mentioned in your talk, I like the sentence that said, valuing diversity is embracing the richness of differences, and you shared with us your own personal experience as well. So what are some ways we can actively apply that concept of diversity and inclusion into our study ideas and design?
So I think it's quite, as Dr. Sameer said, a lot of the stuff which is a little bit abstract. So, I mean, if you take yourself as living in this part of the world in the Middle East, and then you compare yourself with Canada or the US or the UK and so on, population is quite diverse. So, I mean, look at the population in the Middle East, in the UAE, for example, you've got maybe 80, 89, 90% people who are expats. So when you do a research project, actually, it's quite difficult to have a local indigenous flavor to it, because it's difficult, because you've got so rich in terms of culture. I mean, giving you an example, look at the first trial of the COVID vaccine in the UAE. So it was very culturally diverse. It wasn't just expats who were part of for the first vaccine trial. You had your local Emiratis, you had people from across the world. So I think it's very important when you're designing a research trial to see how in terms of how you can make it replicable for populations in other parts of the world as well. So there's no point doing a research project which is only applicable to somebody who lives in Abu Dhabi and has no meaning to somebody who lives in Montreal or London or New York, for example. So, and I know some projects obviously won't have global impact, but they obviously can have some regional impacts. So there's no point doing putting in equality and diversity and inclusion and making sure everything's in place and every tick box is exercised, but actually it has no actual meaning to it. So I think to be designing a research protocol, you've got to look at all the confounding factors which are part of any research protocol in terms of how you're going to constructively blind your study, for example, to make sure that it has equal representation from all classes of people of socio-economic background, of culture, of religion. So it should have no bearing on the fact that where you're living, what you're doing, what your skin color is, what your genotype is, etc. So it should be very, very transparent in that aspect in terms of doing your protocol. I think it's quite a challenging topic to actually discuss, and I'm sure Dr. Sameer will agree. It's people have done theses and dissertations and PhDs on just EDIs, so I think it's a very, very difficult topic to discuss in 15 or 20 minutes. But I think, as I mentioned in the lecture, it's not just relevant to research or just research protocol. I think it's a life lesson in terms of EDI. So I think it's not something which is just related to just your research project. I think it's a life lesson. It has to be what you do every day in your work in terms of inclusion. You're working every day with people who are coming from very diverse backgrounds. So I think this is something which needs to be incorporated as part of our life as well. So I think it's a difficult question. I tried to answer it as best as I can, but I think there's no clear answer. But I think it is what it is. And I think people just need to be aware of the fact that you have to have your protocol has to be very, very robust to make sure that there is no bias at all from an EDI perspective.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Omar. We
Can I
still
add,
have, yeah,
Can I add a little
Dr. Sameer.
thought to that in addition, because I know we talk about EDI in studies. I think it's also important in EDI when it comes to authorship and research. We as a society do a terrible job of being inclusive for all races and all genders. So to give you an example, if you look at a whole bunch of literature and guidelines and RCTs and New England stuff, a lot of them in the past were mostly done by men, and particularly white Caucasian men, with not many other people included. So I think as things have evolved, they still have more men and less women. And now women are more coming into the fold and people of different backgrounds. And I think the onus is on us as men to be more inclusive. So I'll give you an example. When we do guidelines now, when we're doing studies, it's a deliberate process of looking at all of our authors to say, okay, yes, all of these people can contribute, but is there, say, if I'm doing a cardiology study, is there a female cardiologist who's just as capable as this male person? Why do we have an extra man on board? Why can't we bring in just as qualified as a female physician on board? Or an example, why can't we bring an African Canadian or an African American person on board for this guideline who is just as qualified as another person? So just from an outside of patient perspective, I think we all need to keep doing a better job of getting strength from all backgrounds, just like Dr. Omar was saying as well.
Yeah, I totally agree. It has to be an active process from like all the stakeholders involved and not just passive. Any last words from both the speakers, Dr. Omar, Dr. Sameer? We still have some time for any questions that the audience want to send to us regarding the topics discussed today: ethics, confidentiality, IRB, bias, and blinding. So if there, yeah. Okay.
Yes, I think it's a very good venture in terms of setting up a research sort of curriculum for validation, for making sure that the residents within the UAE, where there is not much of a culture in terms of research, to be able to instill some sort of research ideas where you'll have some products coming out of it. I'm sure the same is in Canada, where I trained. In the UK, you had to have some research project or a dissertation before you actually could graduate. So you were not allowed to pass out from your program until you had. In fact, if you look at what we used to do, is we actually had to have one quality improvement project every year to be presented at a local or regional conference to be actually able to progress into the next year, and a dissertation was part of our final exam as well. So I think it's difficult. I think the way they're going to build into the new system in terms of how it works with the new boards coming into the UAE, I think research is going to become part of a mandated part of your research, a mandated part of your residency, as far as I'm aware, with the new Emirati board coming into its existence. So I think research will become part of your curriculum as well. So I think this is a really good venture. I don't think there's a venture like this which exists in the Middle East at the moment anyway. So there are other ventures like this in across other countries, but not in the Middle East. I think it's a really good venture. And as Dr. Sameer said, it's very difficult to have a grasp of all research until you actually start doing research. So once you start doing research, all of these things will start to come into place. And when you're actually writing up a protocol or an abstract or something or a proposal, it'll all come into place. So it all seems a bit jumbled at the moment, but by the end of the year, I think you should be able to grasp at least 30% of what you should be knowing, and then things will progress from there. I think I'm still learning.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you, Dr. Omar, for those kind words. So if there are no further questions from the audience, this brings us to the end of today's module. Thank you to the speakers, Dr. Sameer and Dr. Omar, for 2 amazing lectures today. All the participants today, don't forget to hit the link in the chat box and fill in the feedback form to download your CME certificate. Over to you, Nada.
Right, thank you, Sania. So on behalf of the entire team here at ECREM, I'd like to thank both our speakers for their time, cooperation, and all your valued contributions to our project and our initiative. Thank you to Sneem, our host, for working your magic behind the scenes. And thank you to each and every member of the audience for your participation. We hope this module will help open up some conversations surrounding blinding, bias, confidentiality, and ethics. And see you all next month in April with Module 4 of the Research Workplan, where we'll discuss data measurements and literature reviews. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, guys. Goodbye.